Well, welcome everybody, and a big thank you to the Ambassador for that kind of rather illuminating speech. I think I need to have a little lie down now after I sort of look at, I mean, that notion of a quarter of the world's graduates coming out of India by 2030 is quite a startling one, isn't it? And but I think if we sort of switch tack now, and we're going to talk about international student exchange. This has been a recurring topic during the conference. It's critically important to all of us. I was very struck when yesterday our Minister for Higher Education made quite a play of the importance of Erasmus Plus and the changes that were taking place with the European University Alliances, and the fact that 13 million staff and students have taken part in Erasmus since 1987, which is a phenomenal number. So, by way of introduction, I mean, we know that international student exchange is really important for universities. It's important because we seek to develop global citizenship. It's also very important for graduate employability. There's a very strong link between undertaking an exchange experience and subsequent employability. Although, remember yesterday, if you were here in that session, the representative from the Union of Students in Ireland made the comment that, to the extent that exchange tends to be for the wealthier students, exchange can risk heaping privilege on privilege. It's only the rich students that can go on exchange, and then they get the additional enhanced employability. So we'll come back to that. And finally, I think my personal view is international exchange is really important in developing critical thinking, because it kind of exposes people to a different worldview, and it makes it much easier to kind of think critically about our own assumptions. So what we're going to look at today is, Erasmus Plus has been, as Simon Harris said yesterday, the main driver of international mobility over the last 30 years. The most recent data are that I think in a couple of years ago, it was about 650,000 students and staff a year were on Erasmus-funded exchange. So we're going to look at four themes. One is, what does the future hold for Erasmus Plus? The second is really, what are the emerging challenges as we try to increase participation of underrepresented groups in exchange? Third area is, and we'll particularly look to Margaret to lead on this one, but it's how is the UK's post-Brexit replacement, the Turing scheme, how is that working out? And then we'll turn to Girish and we'll look at what are the tools. We're increasingly managing international mobility on an industrial scale. What tools do we have, can we look to support us? So I'm joined for these questions by four very experienced and distinguished panelists. We've got Girish, who is the head of product for QS Simmons. We've got Shauna from UCD, who's the director of Global Relations, Partnerships and Mobility. Welcome. We've got Catherine, who's the vice rector for academic affairs from the University of Luxembourg. And we've got Margaret, who's the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Global Engagement, and the Chair of French and Intercultural Communication at Queen's University Belfast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of kick off each topic by asking one of our panelists to sort of lead us off, and then I'll bring others in, and if anybody has questions, just put your hand up and we'll kind of take those and weave that into the conversation. Is that okay? So I'd like to start with Erasmus Plus and the developments in Erasmus Plus. When it first started, it was really focused on semester-length exchanges, and it was sometimes criticised as being academic tourism, relatively superficial, where students were going just for a semester holiday, as it were. The current programme is really seeking to embed student mobility institutionally through a range of initiatives like the Erasmus Mundus joint degrees, and particularly the university alliances, of which we now have 44, and the target is to get to 60 by the end of 24. So if I can sort of start with Shauna, just what do you see as the most exciting and transformational changes that this current Erasmus programme, 21 to 27, is going to bring about in student mobility?
Thanks, Nigel. Well, I think it's a really exciting period. As you mentioned already, Nigel, Minister Harris yesterday had said, or reflected on Ireland being one of the first founding member states to join the Erasmus programme in 1987. And for us at UCD, that we were in from the very concept. So it's been wonderful to see the evolution of that in terms of from a student and staff perspective as it's grown and evolved. Before I just talk about the exciting aspects in the funding programme, just to give you a little bit of context around UCD, we are obviously a Dublin-based institution. We're a research-intensive institution with over 38,000 students in Dublin, with just 30% of those students are international, which come from nationalities, over 150 different nationalities. So we've got a very globally focused institution. So for us, student mobility has been embedded within our university culture for a long time. And within our global engagement strategy, we are striving actively to create a global experience for all. So with over 440 exchange agreements, we actually reflected about 6-7 years ago around what mobility meant for us as an institution before the next funding round of the Erasmus+. And we actually tagged a definition I'm just going to share that with you today to help you understand the concept for us. So from a UCD perspective, anything over 5 days, 5 working days spent abroad to work or study as part of a programme or recognised by other mechanisms of the institution is defined as mobility at UCD. So the comment around the semester-long exchange, I think the first thing we have to reflect on is how different the journey we've travelled in terms of that it's no longer 1 semester or 2 semester. And it is not unique to UCD. I'm sure a lot of the institutions here in the room today have student mobility embedded at the heart of what they're doing within their mandatory programs, and I know Catherine will speak to that in terms of that integration piece. But for us, in terms of with the new funding model, one of the key takeaways is around how flexible it is. And when it was launched in 2021, it provides an opportunity for us as an institution to look at a number of different models for mobility that would have been quite unique. And I want to reflect on 2 of them today and give examples from a UCD perspective. The blended intensive mobility, or BIPS as what you'd call, is probably one of the most exciting parts that was within that existing programme. And for us, to give you an example in terms of in 2017, we introduced a programme called the NICE programme, and it is a 12-week virtual mobility programme which was originally created through a key action partnership with 6 partner institutions across Europe. And initially funded under a strategic partnership, it has now evolved into what we call a blended intensive programme. And we currently still run this programme with 4 different institutions, ourselves, the University of Edinburgh, Amsterdam and University of Padova, who were founding partners, and also the National University of Kiev, who came on board last year in 2022 for this initiative. So just to give you a little bit of example around this, and this is a 12-week programme which enables our students to work towards building their international competencies culturally and to facilitate entrepreneurship. So it's a really unique blended intensive programme which is 12 weeks in duration and finalised in a summer school, which is this year taking place from the 2nd of July in the University of Padova. It is credit-bearing. It's awarded by the University of Padova, and it's 3 ECTS, so it's really speaking to all of the new initiatives that our new Erasmus Plus funding programme is providing. And it's been so well received by current students that it is a prime example of how you can be based in Dublin, have this wonderful global challenge where you're working in virtual teams with students from all of these different partner institutions that facilitate an opportunity to solve a global challenge. And it's something that we're very keen to build on, and it's something I'm very excited about as we evolve through the next funding model. In addition to that, the Erasmus Mundus programme is something that has been really successful from a UCD perspective, But I suppose one of the most exciting things in the new funding cycle is the Erasmus Mundus design measures piece. And anybody who's been involved in an Erasmus Mundus initiative will understand the work, the time, the academic engagement to actually facilitate and to establish these programs. And we have a very successful Erasmus Mundus program. And just to give you an example, it's our NOAA, which is a network of humanitarian action, which is a program that allows our students to study at 3 institutions across Europe and the world. And it offers those students to work in terms of 2 years, 4 semesters, and it's a total of 120 ECTS credits. But to establish that, and I reflect on the work that my academic colleagues and my colleagues within UCD Global, supporting them in terms of the funding cycle to actually establish that, was extensive. And there needs to be appetite from the academic community to really buy into that. So I suppose where I'm most excited around the design measures for Erasmus Mundus is that this develops €55,000 one-off 15-month funding to really test, to develop new and highly innovative integrated master's programs so that you can actually see if they're feasible and they're going to work. And that is part of the ongoing struggle that probably all of us have as institutions to ensure that we try and engage our academic community, that they can see benefit and return for them from an academic perspective. So that is something that I'm very keen for us to explore, those 2 areas. Just before I move on, just to touch on probably the enabling environment that supports all of this. And everything within the Erasmus Plus model, it's going to be very important to underpin this, to define what we want from our mobility partnerships. And we are a member of a European University Alliance, Una Europa. We are one of 11 partner institutions who joined the European Alliance in 2022. Una Europa was established in 2019, and it has been a really fast-paced and wonderful experience being part of an alliance, but it's also opened up the opportunities to build super partnerships that look at really striving to build what the European University of the future looks like. So we have just launched our strategic plan under Una Europa for 2030, and and we've just received over 14.4 million as an alliance to launch the Una Futura project, which looks at integrating our research, 3 core pillars in that strategic agenda: research, society, and also student. And one of the things that I would encourage institutions to reflect on in terms of is the alliances really do provide that superpower for the partnerships to enable you to come together to collectively look at initiatives and to pilot initiatives and to look at proposals for funding as an alliance. And just on that, if anybody is, in terms of from an Una Europa perspective, if you want to check out the alliance, they have developed under the previous funding model a number of what we call JIFs. And these are joint innovative formats, and they're designed for education practitioners and policymakers. And there's one specifically developed for mobility, which was under the One Europe project, which was previously funded. And this looks at mobility across virtual, physical, and blended at undergraduate level, at master level, and PhD level. So it was that collective expertise coming together to really support what we can do. So there is loads of exciting. I think the future is bright in the sense of, but what's going to be really important is that you have the right structures and the right enabling environment to help your academic and professional services staff to leverage as much as possible and to guide them through the funding application and ensure that they're meeting their KPIs, their desired outcomes from a college and school perspective as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think that's given us a good flavour of the kind of changed nature of, for those of you not from Europe, the changed nature of the kind of Erasmus Plus. It's much more now about building institutions and about building programs. It's not about simply exchanging students. It's a much deeper engagement. And I think as also came over quite well, you know, you have to have a good acronym. You need a snappy acronym for your, so all of our projects have things like Emerge and Trip and Tell Me and so on. So if we move on and look at the benefits of this international mobility. I move on to Catherine. The universities like the University of Luxembourg have sort of increasingly begun to make international mobility a mandatory part of their degree programs. And I suppose, Catherine, if I could move us on, I mean, what do you see as the kind of key learning outcomes that can only be achieved by international mobility?
I think to give an element of context, thank you. Luxembourg, founded the University of Luxembourg, which is its only public university, in 2003. And at that point, there was a lot of government resistance around the idea of mobility. Traditionally, young Luxembourgers go abroad to study. They had no option. Jean-Claude Juncker was Prime Minister, and he said he didn't want a university, that it would create a narrowing of perspectives, a narrowing of minds. So for all bachelor students, mobility is mandatory, and it's built into the university law. 2003 also meant that the university implemented the Bologna process as part of its design. So the idea is that students should be able to spend at least one semester abroad at some point in their studies. There's also a perverse advantage to this, which is that it's a small university in a country which only has 500,000 people. So actually having students away at various points helps us, okay, with our internal capacity. For the moment, we've got 330 students on mobility. Outgoing, we've also got incoming students, and we tend to have a smaller number of incoming students. That's only Erasmus. We've also got non-EU, non-Erasmus scheme mobilities as well. We also have 111 co-tutelle partnerships for our PhDs. And we've got about 1,000 PhDs. So out of those, many of them will also have a period of study in another country. 50% of our students are international. That means non-Luxembourg residents and non-Luxembourg nationals. And out of those 50%, 25% of those are non-EU. So therefore, what we can see as key learning outcomes, which are built in to the university design, is cross-cultural experience, employability, which is directly related to inward and outward mobility. In Luxembourg, half the population comes over a border every morning and leaves in the evening, which is not so great for the transport on the roads, but is very, very important in terms of that constant flow of best practice, experience, and opportunity. We have a number of double degrees, we have a number of binational and trinational programs, and what we can see there is an enormous amount of attractivity in terms of opportunities. We have one, for example, which is shared between Luxembourg University, the former University of Metz, now Université de Lorraine, and University of Saarbrücken, and that keeps going because the students in Saarbrücken and in Metz are very attracted to the idea of employment within Luxembourg and access. In this context, it's about media studies, access to a very, very lively media environment in Luxembourg. However, the same is not true in the other direction. So some of our learning outcomes we need to redesign and redefine as our population changes and as our employability profile changes in order to make it attractive to local students as well. So I think in terms of the key outcomes, obviously everybody says language. Luxembourg is a trilingual country, 3 official languages plus English as a growing lingua franca across the international community. Languages are taken for granted, but we know that it is a challenge. And also some of our Erasmus Plus partnerships are building language learning into that Erasmus Plus. We have one, which is Université, which is for space studies, and that's with universities across Europe, including Sweden and Poland. And in Luxembourg, we don't actually have any language schools that teach Swedish and Polish. So the result of it is that across that particular consortium network, we now have an app, and the students can meet up for language cafes, language exchanges, language tandems, all of those different varieties of language learning. And built into it is that idea that the world doesn't speak English, space is probably not going to speak English either, and in order to survive in space, in your little capsules, you need to learn more than one language. So learning Swedish, Polish, Italian, French, German is all part of the deal. And those are very important learning outcomes as well. So obviously, as you said, critical thinking, a distance, decentering yourself, extremely important. So in a country with 3 frontiers, being at the center of that is part of the deal as well.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, particularly when you start with, we speak 4 languages, let's add Swedish and Polish.
Yeah.
It's coming from the more monocultural institutions, it's quite daunting. I'd like to start just a follow-up, Catherine, but maybe open this up to others. It's this question that came up yesterday from the Union of Students in Ireland around certain groups not being able to access exchange opportunities. So, I'm thinking particularly people from lower income groups that may depend on part-time working, people who've got caring responsibilities, disabled students. So maybe we might ask each of you, but what are you doing particularly to try and address that issue?
Well, we actually do a system of waivers. So if a student, for example, is under international protection, they're not allowed to travel, so that's an automatic waiver. However, a student who has a disability, who's the sole learner in their family, the sole person with a full-time long-term contract, which happens. We have students who run the family restaurant, for example. Those students are given a waiver. However, we still want them to get that experience. We've got 2 options. We're lucky we've got a frontier, so we can send somebody an hour away to Metz or to Trier. But if that's not possible, we did, in the COVID context, have virtual mobilities. Montpellier 3, for example, students who were able to do mobility a long way away. We actually still had students going to Korea and Japan virtually. We've been able to maintain some of that. There is a legal obligation to have classes in person, however. But above all, it's about developing, for example, COILs, which are collaborative online classes. We had an experimental short course, actually only about 7 weeks, with a university in Brazil a couple of years ago. Also within our programs, we have a trinational partner agreement, for example, a program that's run with Canada. So 2 universities in this part of Europe plus Canada, and the students going to Canada are given financial support to go there. And finally, we have an extremely active hardship fund. And we just make sure that students who would like to travel are given the money in order to be able to do so. We can send about 25 students a year with a significant amount of funding help, plus some industry sponsorships in some cases.
Okay. So anything you'd want to add to that in terms of support for the less represented groups, Margaret?
I think a very similar picture to what Catherine has highlighted there in terms of some of the opportunities that had to be created in the context of the pandemic have persisted now post-pandemic. So often for students who are not able to travel, there is that opportunity to have the virtual experience. It's clearly not what we'd want as an ideal, but that's a possibility. I think one of the things perhaps that's different in the UK context, and perhaps one of the benefits of Turing has been that Turing has been very proactive in trying to increase participation in international activity amongst students from a widening participation background. So they have increased the amount of funding to support students from that background. That's been, I think, very welcome. It's one of the positives of Turing for sure. I think what we've also tried to do as an institution, we have done things like the COIL opportunities that Catherine mentioned specifically with the US. But we've also been very proactive in our philanthropic activity most recently to ensure that there are opportunities for outward student mobility for students from a widening participation background. Colleagues in the room may have seen some of the publicity around the Agreement 25 conference that we had most recently in Queen's. Out of that, we launched a Clinton Scholarship Fund, and whilst we can't insist that all of that goes to widening participation backgrounds, that's certainly the demographic that we're hoping to target there. So philanthropy, COIL, Turing, that's certainly one of the positives, is that focus on inclusion there. But otherwise, the sorts of systems of waivers are also in place for people with family circumstances that would mean it's just very difficult to travel.
Yeah. And we'll come on to Turing momentarily. I'm going to turn to Shauna in a second just to see, I think some of your short cycle might be particularly helpful, but if anybody in the audience has got any particular suggestions about how you're tackling this issue of participation in exchange, please put your hand up and share, because it's a conversation, not just a one-way flow. But Shauna, do you want to just tell us, a little bit about what you're doing in terms of trying to kind of get that access for?
Yeah, so we obviously work very cross-functionally across UCD with their access centre to support students that have basically access to all. We also, very similar to what Margaret said in terms of from a funding perspective, we do leverage our international networks and consortia and our European University Alliances for those that are able to travel and wish to maybe do that virtually as well or physically. in terms of maybe it's a socioeconomic barrier to travel. So we do scholarship, certain initiatives to support students who wish to participate to different partner institutions based on our networks and consortia. In addition to that, we publicise in terms of, as part of our marketing and engagement campaign, to ensure that this is actually for students when they're thinking about a mobility experience. And we actually have a module that we've developed as part of another key action project, which is called DigiPass, which we've just launched internally within UCD, which is a Brightspace module, which is the student system that we use within UCD that showcases the 4 stages of the life cycle. So some students who may think this is beyond their reach from the get-go don't actually consider it. And that's the students that we really want to try and engage, because they are automatically making a decision before even considering it. So we have developed this module in partnership with 6 different partners across Europe that looks at that pre-departure. So what does mobility mean for me, and can I achieve it? And then looking at all of the different orientation, and may that be there could be special requirements for people with disabilities, what they need, and that's part of the orientation aspect of the module. And then looking in terms of during the mobility and the supports that they could have whilst they travel, may that do physically or virtually, and then after the mobility experience, how do they leverage that off from it? So if that helps the students understand that this isn't beyond my reach, that it actually isn't for those that maybe are financially at a means or have the access to this opportunity. And it's to change that mindset. So we've been working very closely with trying to engage the students in that to help them consider it from the outset.
Okay, great. So let's move on to Turing, if no one wants to come in here. So Margaret, I mean, you know, you're representing the non-EU institution here. You know, in terms of the kind of post-Brexit Turing scheme, how does it differ from the Erasmus scheme that we know?
Okay. So I should say that we are in the UK in a sort of transitional phase, in the sense that we have a certain amount of Erasmus funding that we're still using. And so obviously putting that and dedicating that towards many of our existing European partnerships, but that will come to an end in sort of April 2024, and then we will be primarily reliant on Turing. I should say also that I guess the Northern Ireland situation is slightly distinctive from other parts of the UK, particularly in the context of the government south of the border working with us very proactively to try to encourage continued participation actually in Erasmus. And the Republic of Ireland government has given us the opportunity to register our students temporarily in universities south of the border to allow them to be Erasmus students. Now, that has been practically more challenging than it sounded in theory, and we're still trying to work through how we might want to do that. But further discussions have included actually use of monies that have been given and created by the government in the Republic of Ireland to support mitigations against the impacts of Brexit on North-South collaboration. And again, you know, there is an opportunity even for funding to be given to Northern Irish institutions in order to support those sorts of collaboration. So a very positive picture of North-South collaboration here to try to mitigate those effects. In terms of the scheme itself, I mean, I should say that it is extremely welcome, and for all the reasons that you said, Nigel, at the start, around opportunities for students to have that experience, a different mental landscape that comes from that experience of other cultures, the critical thinking. So Turing is very, very welcome. I should say that's clearly the preface to saying what's wrong with it. But very, very welcome in that sense. And what has certainly been positive is the fact that, yes, it's opening up the possibility of travel across the world, so beyond Europe, and in that sense different from Erasmus. I think that's been helpful in terms of widening participation, because perhaps students who haven't really thought very much of international travel and don't have multiple languages are perhaps more open to the possibility of travelling to an Anglophone country. So I think that's a positive. It's been good for our students doing, for example, medical electives in Africa, in Asia, South America, who previously didn't have access to funding. So this has helped them go and do that sort of voluntary work, social innovation work. It's positive also, I think, in the sense that this funding is open to schools and to FE as well as HE. So even coming back to Shauna's point, we can almost start students at a much earlier stage to think about the possibilities of what travel could be. Also positive is that it's not the traditional semester abroad. So the minimum requirement is a month. And again, I think for widening participation reasons, that's very positive. I mean, I think about the Northern Irish context, our two main universities, Queen's and Ulster, both have quite significant undergraduate populations who are local. In Queen's, 30% of our student population is widening participation background. So we have a lot of students who have simply not had an experience of international mobility. And so the fact of it being maybe only 4 weeks is very, very helpful in that regard as well. Although the feedback from the sector is if you want to be really serious about the widening participation, we should allow this to be available to periods of time under 4 weeks as well. So those are definitely the positives. I think the challenge is, I think I listened to what Shauna is saying about the Erasmus Mundus programme, and that's, Turing is just not offering any of that. We talk about the Turing scheme, but to think of it as a scheme in the way that Erasmus is a scheme is simply not the case. There isn't that wraparound for curriculum development, for genuine partnership. It is simply a pot of money to support students to spend time abroad. And I think the key flaw then in the conceptualization of it is that it is for outward student mobility only, it's not for inward student mobility. So when Switzerland came out of Erasmus 10 years ago, they created their own scheme. I think the acronym is SEMP, but that supported outward and inward mobility. It just means that it's not a strong basis for partnership building. I think that's the issue here. And as Shauna was saying, student mobility can be a phenomenal experience for the students, but it's also an incredible stepping stone for the sorts of intellectual research, collaborative curriculum type partnerships that are simply not going to happen in a scheme like Turing. So I think that's the downside of it, the key one. The other one, I suppose, is that Erasmus has been part of our DNA in institutions. It's built into our international strategies, and that's partly facilitated by the fact that we are signed up for 7 years on a year-by-year basis, or 6 years on a year-by-year basis. We have a fairly light touch indication of what we're going to do, but essentially you're in the club for 7 years or 6 years. Turing, we start each year from scratch, full application, massive audit each year, and it also requires us to be extremely specific about what we're doing with the money, to the sense of we are going to send 7 students to this institution in North America for 3 months. They're going on the 5th of September and they're coming back 3 months later. Wow. It really is that level. So if you think about doing that every year, if you think about a very, very significant audit each year, much more so than under Erasmus, our colleagues are, I suppose, so embedded in the administration of it that actually it's very hard also then to plan for a longer term strategic collaboration between partners. So that has led to quite a lot of practical challenges as well for universities just in negotiating this. The funding itself, as I said, is very welcome. In our first year, the first year of the scheme, we got 60% of what we asked for. This past year, 50%. That's typical across the UK. So there is an anxiety going forward when the Erasmus money runs out as to what we can support. And we'll have to put that funding to those degrees where the international mobility is built in as a compulsory part. And my concern is that will not actually open up more possibilities for students who haven't previously thought about international activity to travel.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, just in terms of the way Turing works, I mean, I think you spelled out a number of the advantages of it. What I'm trying to grapple with is what's the kind of ask when you go to a foreign partner and say, can we send you 5 students? They'll be fully funded. We don't want to pay fees. How does that work? Do they typically send students in the opposite direction, funding them themselves?
It's been a bit of a mixed response. What we have done on the whole is to go to our existing Erasmus partners to try to maintain those relationships. In some cases, those partners have said you can be, obviously as people know with Erasmus, 20% of that funding can go to a third party who's outside the Erasmus scheme. Some of our partners have said we'll use that 20% to keep you in. Others have said, no, we want to use that for partners further afield. So what we're trying to do is to sign bilateral partnerships, but it is very dependent on the universities themselves being willing to put the money in. And it doesn't feel like a very strong offer as we go to partners when we can't offer that funding. Now, that's something we'll have to do, and we're looking at each of our regional strategies to think about, okay, how do we start to identify anchor partners in each of those countries? We've done this quite extensively already in North America, and we've put appropriate funding behind those partnerships to ensure that we do have that sort of reciprocity. We're going to have to do that in a more sustained way across our European partners, which we probably took for granted because we had Erasmus, and across a number of regional areas. But I think some of the big disadvantages are in precisely the sorts of areas that Shauna has highlighted. You know, the capacity to have staff mobility, whether that's professional services or academics, the possibility of doing the sort of collaborative master's programs, even collaborative summer schools that would allow students to move around institutions. We're having to start and build those from scratch and find the funding to do those. And that, I would say, is the key disadvantage.
Okay, thanks for that. And I think if we move on to the fourth area, many universities, the proportion of students engaging in mobility is growing. I think in my own university, we're at 30% of students going out. We're rising to 40%. And the mobilities themselves are becoming much more complex because they're integrated into program design, into dual degrees, the alliance-based universities. We were trying to manage all this with spreadsheets. It was becoming an absolute nightmare. So I guess as a kind of service provider, what are the problems you're seeing universities having with the management of mobility, and what are the kind of tools that are available to make it easier to manage?
Yeah, well, as mobility programs get more attention and becomes part of the standard curriculum and offering and all that, the more student participating in each year in these programs, more funding coming in, and there are more complexities getting added to this program. Blended intensive program is an example of a complexity that got added. Erasmus Plus now has something called green travel, where you get additionally paid. So there are lots of complexities that's coming in. It's a huge administrative burden for universities. Certainly so for universities who have lots of options, 4 weeks, 3 months, 6 months or a semester, and so on. And it's important to understand what does the process entail. It all starts by ensuring you tell the student the right opportunities they have for mobility, right? And then there is a application process, there is a selection process, there's a lot of documentation process. If it's there's a visa consideration and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of documentation that comes in. Funding is very good from a student perspective, but adds lots of headache for the administrators, right? And most of it, all this green travel and additional supports and so on. So it's a nightmare to some extent. And the way universities are better off managing this is to use digital tools, right? Digital tool could be Excel or Google spreadsheets and so on. But that could be helpful if you have just, let's say, 50, 100 mobilities per year. But if you run beyond that, it becomes sort of a highly inefficient operation because you have multiple disjointed tools who don't talk to each other. The data don't, progress from one system to the other system. So it becomes a partial digitalization, which creates more problem than really helping. So a good tool which would help to ensure the processes that you want can be customized and adapted. All the legal concerns like GDPR and various other things are well taken care. At the same time, as the ability to make sure you quickly change as and when you need it. For example, as and when Corona struck, there's a lot of concern about the security of students, right? So if you had a digital tool, you probably could have, with a click of few buttons, an easy access to the emergency contact and an ability to reach out to students to check where they are they safe, and other mechanisms that you typically employ with your risk management, right? So there is an increasing burden. The complexities that's coming in, which is all good from the mobility, the effectiveness, the learning outcomes, and all that perspective, but certainly it's becoming a big nightmare. And the other part is most of the mobility office or the folks who manage mobilities at universities are understaffed, right? There's always too much of work for them, and most times there's also burden from the student side because there's always a point of not filling the forms properly, not submitting the documents correctly. You have silly things like the end date of mobility is before the start date of, and these kind of small things which adds up the work, which does a lot of, adds burden. So all these are sort of things that adds to the complexity, and certainly some cases it's being funded, but I think the other aspect is also the emerging aspect of the problem that is digitalization in some sense, especially the EWP with Erasmus without paper. The way that's being done is also something which is not appropriate. You're trying to standardize the process and at the same time digitize it. And that's creating a big nightmare because people were used to a different set of data collection and processes. Now they've been asked by their national agencies and EU to ensure they follow a certain process. Now, so they have to realign things. The tools being used, the EWP network is not fully baked yet. And as a result, all that is adding further headache to the existing burden that the administrators have. So it's really complex now. Hopefully, it will get better as digitalization improves and processes gets better. But I think from an institution perspective, they need to have a good tool which sort of adopts to their processes, make sure all the legal concerns are taken care, and has a better experience for students as well.
Okay. And it sounds as if as complex as Erasmus Plus is, that the Turing has kind of taken that to another level with the complexity of forward planning. Can I stop for a second to see if there are any questions from the floor? Yes.
I have a question that's not necessarily related to the administration and,
Of course, no, to any of the
right,
speakers now.
okay. It was a little bit triggered by what you had said, Nigel, as an opening, as internationalization and mobility as a way to kind of put students in the deep end and let them learn things and 21st century skills. I wonder if the panel has any ideas or best practices on how that student learning and sense making is captured. Because that's something that we struggle with, how to capture the learning and how to help the students make sense of what exactly has happened to them on a personal level, on a professional level, while they've been abroad. Okay, so the question is, how do you measure the learning impact of that exchange? Is that what you mean? Yeah, sure. And also tools or methods or ways to do that.
Sure. I can speak a little bit to that because before I came to the University of Luxembourg, I was a head of Department of Modern Languages, and so we were dealing with year abroad students. And it was precisely that issue about how you actually measured, not in ECTS or in achievement in exams, where the students are at a disadvantage, they don't know the system, etc., but actually the quality of it. And so we had a number of things, and one of my favorite ways of assessing it, though it gave a headache to everybody, was that the students would do a film, and they would do a film in the target language, and they would place themselves in context or out of context if they'd gone to 2 countries, and they would talk about something they'd found interesting. And they would talk about their learning in terms of that topic that they'd found interesting. Maybe they'd got involved in some elections, maybe they'd seen a change happening around them, maybe they'd experienced something about workplace culture which particularly inspired them. And it was about seeing the quality of their engagement with that experience of being there, so outside the strictly academic setting, but we turned it into an academic exercise. Obviously, it's very old in modern languages departments. It's replaced the dissertation that used to be compulsory, or in terms of students doing a work placement on their year abroad, it would be a dissertation that would be a reflective piece about their experience of teaching in lots of schools, or working for Siemens in Paris, or wherever, That's actually a really, really useful way of capturing not the sheer academic, did I attend lectures, because a lot of the time they don't, but actually the quality of their experience and their critical thinking, as Nigel said.
And if I can add to that, we have seen institutions using Move On, recording the experience, not just the academic aspects, but also the staying, the interactions with students and the faculty members and various other stuff, methodically at the end of their mobility process. And each student has to fill it. Most institutions do insist it. And it's all recorded, and it's available for the future students who would want to go to a particular institution or a particular country. And that sort of gives a perspective to the future students as to what they can experience or what they should be careful of. And it also helps institutions to sort of guard against certain problems that students might encounter, starting from housing to various other things. So this is another method that I've seen institutions using it.
Is there anything you want to add? Margaret?
I think my own background obviously is in a modern languages department as well, but have pretty removed from that for a number of years, so not quite sure what new innovations have been brought in. But certainly I recognise very much what Catherine is talking about. I think one of the new areas that we could be looking at in this area is some of the advances in computational linguistics, which would help us not necessarily to measure the kind of academic impacts. As Catherine said, students who go to university tend not to go to their lectures. Anyway, it's much more about the social capital benefits that can accrue through the experience and the less kind of tangible impacts, such as the critical thinking. I think there are opportunities here for us to be collaborating with computational linguistics colleagues, even to capture some of the ways of speaking of our students, not necessarily in the languages of the countries that they're visiting and are working in, but even in English, to understand what are the shifts in their language, what are the confidence type shifts, the ability to articulate themselves, to be able to articulate values and changes in their own behaviour that we could capture at the beginning, at the end of the experience, and actually so you're taking qualitative data, but how could we actually quantify that using the sorts of technologies that our colleagues in computational linguistics are doing. So I think that could be an interesting way forwards for us in beginning to capture some of that transformation that we know is there.
Shauna, have you got any experience of measuring outcomes?
So we work with our careers department. So we actually, through the module that I was referencing, the DigiPass module, which is an online module, they do reflective pieces at each stage of the mobility, and they're awarded a badge. It's not for credit, but they are awarded a badge, and it enables them to reflect on different stages. And actually, we then work with their careers department in terms of letting that for them an achievement award that goes on their diploma supplement. So it's a nice way of tying it back in to it was incentivize the students to engage with the module, but also really working about that degree plus piece in terms of what does it mean, that extracurricular part, and how to actually define the impact for that extracurricular activity, which is hard to measure.
Okay. Got time for one last question, otherwise I'll...
There's one.
Yep. Sorry.
Thank you, Nigel. Jennifer Cleary, Head of International at the Irish Universities Association. Really enjoying the panel discussion this morning, and I know it could go on for hours. Shauna, one of the things, as you know, the Irish universities are trying to capture is an idea of outward mobility, numbers, gaps, and also ensuring that we're really looking at inclusive mobility and identifying what are the blockages there. So we've been working with all our universities and trying to capture that data. And one of the initiatives that we've taken as well is we've noticed in a lot of the universities, the international offices and the access offices don't really get to speak to each other or engage so much. And that's going to really significantly help, I think, in identifying those opportunities. I'm just wondering, in terms of the DigiPass, which I love the idea of, and I should know this answer, is there a plan for that to be rolled out across all the institutions? Is that already happening? One of the, I suppose, points that have been made when we actually talk to other organisations or even to parents of students, students don't understand about Erasmus. They don't understand the term mobility. It's even how we market or promote it. So it's secondary school levels. And is there any plans in place or any of the panels to actually capture or to promote at secondary level to get students thinking about it before they even go into college? So a loaded question, but I think DigiPass would actually be something that would really help in terms of that. And I have one more item just to mention, because it does have the future of student mobility. We haven't probably got time to talk about sustainability today, but I think a lot of the models that you've mentioned include terms of virtual mobility, the NICE programme and other programmes that colleagues have mentioned. We really do need to be thinking about that more, and it has been mentioned across other panels, but in terms of our carbon footprint, and UCD, I know Caroline Mangan in particular is huge in promoting the CANI project, which I think a lot of people here, if they don't know about it, should know about it in terms of measuring your goals in terms of carbon footprint and future sustainability. Thank you.
Okay, Jen, you get the prize for the longest question. And we're down to our last 30 seconds. So really quick response.
On DigiPass, it's an open source because it was initially developed through a strategic partnership under Erasmus+. So there's a handbook, so how you can actually adapt that and implement it within your institution. There's also a staff toolkit to support academic staff and professional services staff who want to gauge students in understanding what an exchange or mobility experience is. So yes, it absolutely can be rolled out. And also, just to talk to your sustainability issue, we have developed, under Caroline Mango, who's the Associate Director for Global Community within my team, a UCD Global Green Guide for all incoming and outgoing international students, and also Irish students who are considering a mobility abroad, which reflects on the Green Erasmus, how do I travel to my opportunity, what opportunity does that look like, but also if you're coming to Ireland, what that sustainability means for us as an institution. So yeah, happy to share them both.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I'm looking at the clock in front of me that's gone into minus red numbers, which is indicating we're out of time. So I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists, Girish, Catherine, Shauna and Margaret. If you'd like to give them a round of applause, and thank you for coming. I think we're going straight to coffee now, right?
Yes.
Sorry, here's the boss to tell us what to do.
Thank you very much, Professor Nigel. Yes, we're going off to the coffee break. Now, you might notice we are running quite late, so it'll be a truncated coffee break. We appreciate when that bell rings, very quickly make your way to where you'd like to go. Here, after the break, will be our panel on women in leadership. Upstairs, we have our paper submissions, so there's some really excellent papers that we've received and presentations. Otherwise, make sure to make new colleagues, visit our exhibitors, and when that bell rings, quickly to where you need to go. Thank you very much. See you after the break.